Strings of Malice, Book 1. Snowflake in an Alley. An Old Mother Nonsense Story. Chapter 17. Tower of the Rose. Besides the broken window, turning around did not invoke much more confidence that they had not jumped out of the proverbial frying pan and into the fire. Irinka had assumed that the structure was a temple when they were guided to it, but it was not like any she had ever seen. Not to say that she had been in many, but none showcased pictures on the ceilings and walls of demons winning against warriors of the past. Chipped as the paint was, it wasn't hard to fill in the few missing pieces of the gory scenes. The pillars that lined the entryway and reached up to the unsettling paintings were carved with the faces of terrified mortals, gargoyles screaming and devils cackling in delight at the other's torture. The girl stepped closer to her brother. She was convinced one had just blinked. But that was silly. Statues didn't blink. It also, very quickly, became apparent that this temple was cold. Unnaturally so, as she watched her breath puff out in a cloud of vapor, and her soaked-through clothes felt even colder than when she had been running for her life in a torrential downpour. She shivered, and Lenrith reached back for her, but his hands were iced too.
"It's cold in here,"
she muttered softly, shifting closer to Lenrith.
"Unfortunately, our heat has not worked in some time,"
a voice responded from the shadows ahead, and she wasn't quite sure who screamed louder, only that it couldn't have been her brother. The figure put up its hands as Nimue and Lenrith brandished their weapons, prepared to fight once more.
"Please do not be afraid."
The figure offered a light bow to the company, hands over his chest.
"I heard your banging on the door and came to investigate. You have traveled a dangerous path to get here. Please, let a humble follower of the White Rose see that you are dried and fed."
Irinka was unsure of what food could be offered. The figure was of a man, gaunt and tall, with dark circles under his eyes that looked like he hadn't slept in years. He introduced himself as Father Gekosh and stepped aside to reveal a door, the very flower he spoke of, embroidered into the cuff of his robes.
"Follow me, please."
The group exchanged wary looks, but ultimately decided to go along with the man. White flowers hadn't led them wrong yet. The hallways they were taken through were much the same as the entry hall, perhaps a temple to some demon or other, whose name had been lost to time, Lenrith thought. They briefly passed through the main chapel proper, though not much could be seen in the creeping shadows that spilled off the pulpit like cool smoke. They heard people praying in a language unknown to them, but were quickly led through a door in the wall and down a hallway to a spiraling staircase. There were strange smells as they went along, damp and cold and rot that had gone from sickly sweet to vile, but the obnoxious aromas were only ever fleeting, just enough to make Irinka's nose scrunch and hold her breath, but absent the next time she had to breathe. As they reached the second floor, the company was once again made to consider their options. A hallway decorated in bones, beautiful yet unnerving. The mouse almost spoke up, but the priest turned to her as she drew in a breath and put a finger to his lips. Once past the site, they entered into what appeared to be a rectory.
"The bones do not like sound,"
the priest explained with a mournful tone.
"They are to be remembered for the lives they had, and for any who walk among them to silently contemplate what their body will become once the soul is free of this mortal coil. I trust you will respect that, young one."
Irinka nodded, but still stepped closer behind her brother, not making a peep as the man gestured to one of 3 doors with an ashen, knobbly hand.
"This is the washroom,"
he explained to the woman.
You may take the room on the furthest end of the hall. Gentlemen, if you would follow me to the other side. Our faith does not allow for the sexes to mix, except in mass.
They all looked at Nimue, but she seemed almost as confused as they were. Is the White Rose a moniker for one of the deities? She ended up inquiring for the company. The priest shook his head.
On the contrary, she is an angel unaligned with any deity. Come to our founder in a dream. She blessed her followers with long life if they stayed true to the faith. Unlike the gods who have abandoned us, she is present and permits creation and experimentation over the natural way of things.
His tone became sad as he went on.
I should say, she was present. Unfortunately, she was slain not too long ago. We have kept her mortal body here, and continue the faith in hopes that she will one day need it again.
Nimue's widening eyes and the short puff of mist from her nose said she was taken aback. Praying to a dead god is unusual, she finally offered, but every muscle in her had tensed, and her hand had slowly crept to the hilt of her axe.
She is not dead.
The priest chuckled softly, a raspy, dry sound, only identifiable as such by his shaking shoulders.
Faith relies on more than what we can see, sister. She is risen again, but only in spirit. I will send one of our priestesses to fetch you for Mass this evening, and you will hear all about the superiority of the White Rose.
The priest didn't bother waiting for a reply before prattling off that dinner would be at 7 o'clock and someone would fetch them. If they were so inclined, there was a prayer room upstairs and, should they wish to go wandering about, he admonished that no voices were to be heard in any rooms with memorials of bone. He turned to lead the men back out the way they had come, and Lanrith gave Nimue an imploring look behind the priest's back. She nodded sternly and put a hand on Irinka's shoulder, a wordless vow to protect the girl if anything happened in their strange sanctuary. Despite this, Lanrith could not help but feel uneasy. The macabre version of a temple should have been right up his friend's alley, but Dr. Gascares had not uttered a word since they had passed through the chapel. The only reason he should hold his tongue would be if there was something terribly wrong. Thing was, the storm still raged outside, and if he strained his ears, Lanrith could still hear the horrorlings crying in the rain for their lost meal. They passed through a landing which looked down over the chapel from above, but almost nothing could be seen within the shadows, thick and writhing as they were at the far end. The only source of light within were the small candles in the hands of the priests, but even those within the shadow could not be seen. They were taken into another hallway of bone, and into another rectory, laid out in the mirror of the one on the other side. The priest gave them the same instructions, and encouraged them to rest before taking his leave. Father Gekosh had barely left the room before the doctor noticed Lanrith scribbling in his notebook, but he stopped when the gentleman nodded and placed a hand on it.
I know, my friend, we are not truly safe here,
he agreed.
The tongue the priest downstairs pray in, it is old and one of devils.
Lanrith continued on a new sentence.
Do you know what they were saying?
The doctor made a half-hearted gesture with his hand.
Yes, a little. They were speaking about blood, a lot of it, and the life essence of offering it. I'm not sure how familiar you are with Itolos, the god of life.
Lanrith held up a finger and pointed to the sky.
Yes, indeed, one of the first brothers,
the doctor confirmed.
His imagery is everywhere here. You come to know these things when traveling with a priestess for as long as I have now. But the symbols and the frescoes have been distorted somehow.
He shivered and rubbed at his arms.
Anyway, may as well try to warm up while we can, yes?
Lanrith nodded, but kept his weapons close as they made for the washroom. In the mirrored rectory, Nimue had just finished telling Irinka the same thing, if in a little more detail about the church than about its teachings.
Shouldn't we warn the others?
Irinka asked, hushed and quick. We don't know where they have been taken. Nimue shook her head. No, while they are offering hospitality, we should take it. Just be on your guard for anything strange. You can see in the dark far better than the rest of us. If you see anything that makes you uncomfortable, you tell me straight away, do you hear? The girl hesitantly fidgeted as they stepped into the washroom to find surprisingly warm water.
I am in the chapel. I saw the body.
Which body? The woman asked, quickly taking off her heavily drenched outerwear and setting her axe within arm's reach.
The one on the altar.
Irinka whispered softly.
The body that the priest was talking about. They're keeping it out in the open. I think that might be the bad smell in the air.
Nimue's frown deepened when she tugged off her boots and tipped some water out. Everything about this place is unnatural, she confirmed, and patted the girl's head. Good job, Irinka. Let us get warm now, and find some rest while we can. The thought of getting back into cold clothes was uncomfortable to say the least, but it was certainly better than wandering around this place in the buff. When the woman stepped out of the washroom and into the empty hallway, Irinka started towards the room the priest had pointed to, but Nimue caught her elbow gently and pulled her towards another door. If that is where they know to find us, it would be better if we were not there, the woman offered on a conspiratorial whisper. Irinka had to admit it was a clever plan, and she in turn suggested the room just next door. She knocked and listened, but heard nothing. Nimue kept a hold of her axe tightly as the girl opened the door, but inside was not what they had expected. Beyond the frame was almost nothing. Pitch and shadow so black neither could see even beyond the hinges of the threshold. They jerked back when the dark convinced the two that something moved within, until Nimue's face first showed surprise and then excitement. Irinka worried for her friend as she lowered her axe and put out her hand invitingly towards the gloom. In this life I walk in the light. Nimue began to pray softly, and the something in the shadows shifted more vigorously, black churning in pitch to reveal barely differentiated shades of grey, curling out and licking towards her upturned palms with spectral fingers of their own. With the breath of the first, I pray you step aside and allow me into this holy place. The shadows enveloped her arm entirely, and Irinka began to panic, but Nimue put out her free hand to stop the girl from doing anything. The first light walks with me. At the last of her words, the shadows shivered and retreated. A second door of dark wood had formed in the arch, but it didn't look like the others in this place. A warm, flickering light escaped the thin gap at the bottom and left by the shadows in Nimue's hand a golden key. The woman grinned down at Irinka, who had hid behind her when the shadows had begun to take on forms. Would you like to do the honors, mouse? She teased. Irinka simply glared at her, but Nimue chuckled as she stepped forward, put the key in the lock, turned it, and the new room it opened was lit by holy fire that glinted off finely polished metal. It appeared to be an armory of sorts, Swords and shields, bows and spears hung, lay and rested against nearly every available wall and surface. The room was warm when they stepped into it, and it chased away the chill from their bones as well as any hearth. It smelled vaguely of oil, paper and leather, and it happily welcomed the two women.
What did you do?
Erinka breathed, gazing around in awe.
Is your magic back?
Nimue actually had the gall to laugh. "No, girl, I prayed," she said as though it were the simplest thing in the world. "I told you, this was once a temple to the god of life and light. Even desecrated to the extent it is, his guardians will still be in some places, protecting things evil has no business touching."
But I thought you were a priestess to the Dark Father.
Erinka frowned, subconsciously tapping her arm.
The mark on your shield.
"Following one deity does not mean that the others are off limits to your prayers, Erinka," the woman explained gently, and raised her eyes to a large shield hanging on the back wall, the holy symbol of the life-breather untarnished in gold and silver. "They balance one another, the elders, muses and umbras," she informed the girl, pointing up to where smaller emblems of the other 14 surrounded the shield. "All are very present in our world still, even if they no longer walk among us in physical form. We mortals are all their children, and while they may have their favorites, they will hear us when we talk to them. Adversity will always bend before faith."
Too right you are,
a voice said from behind them. Both spun around to see Father Gekosh standing in the doorway.
though they do not always answer. They can be cruel like that sometimes.
He glanced around the room, but did not let even his curved nose pass the threshold into it.
It has been some time that we have been trying to open this door. How very fortunate our prayers have finally been answered.
Nimue's chin went up and her shoulders went back. Her axe hung limply, but ready in her hand. "Is it time for Mass already?" she asked conversationally.
In light of the recent events,
the man hummed, folding his hands in front of his chest to steeple his fingers.
Perhaps Mass can be cancelled for a much more joyous occasion.
Indeed? The woman cocked her head, shifting to put herself between her ward and the priest. What kind of joyous occasion?
Being allowed the opportunity to be present in the same space as the divine is surely a cause for celebration, is it not?
The man smiled, though it was clearly forced.
The last piece of our ritual to return our white rose has been locked in this very room. Now that it is opened, we will resurrect her with your help.
It was at that point Nimue's false composure of friendliness dropped, and she growled, low and threatening. "You make a mockery out of ceremony," she challenged, her axe shifting up to make ready. "Come in and take what you will. If your dead goddess truly wants to be brought back to this shithole, she will protect you." Neither Father Gekosh nor the handful of priests and priestesses flocking behind him moved to rise to the threat. His thin face pinched into something mean and angry, before his eyes flickered around, and a dark smirk appeared on his face.
Where is your little friend?
He asked lowly, darkly.
Perhaps she might tempt you out.
He muttered a clipped,
"Find the girl."
And all but 2 of his flock left him, sprinting off down the hallways to start checking rooms. Nimue chanced a glance at where Erinka had been. The man was right. She was gone.
No matter,
he huffed before taking a step back from the door and throwing up a hand. Dark words dripped from his tongue. His eyes flashed bright red, and Nimue tensed as magic wrapped around her tight and strong.
My faith has given me this power Well, yours has abandoned you, sister.
Father Gekosh grinned darkly, fingers twisting unnaturally in the wake of his spell.
Now you will bend to my will.
The woman put up a valiant effort, but this was now a house of the White Rose, and her believers under her protection. Nimue was a tough one, but her eyes eventually misted over. Her axe vanished into thin air, and the priest clicked his teeth impatiently, uncaring as two other robed figures stepped up beside him.
Stubborn,
he hissed at Nimue, but the woman simply stared blankly ahead until he snapped a direct order at her.
Bring me the book.
Irinka could only watch in horror, held bruisingly in place and silenced by the shadow guardian she had caught a glimpse of at the door, as Nimue turned slowly and began walking stiffly towards her. The shadow dragged the mouse silently out of the way, and Nimue moved within a breath of her, picking up a mace from a rack as she went. The shattering of glass sounded throughout the room, and the woman retraced her steps, now with a large tome in her hands. Father Gekosh almost lost his hold on her when he excitedly beckoned, and she stopped just at the edge of the threshold.
Take the book,
the man all but growled to the cloaked priest to his left. The priest tried to take it, and instantly screamed bloody murder as they ignited into flames so hot there was only ash left a moment later. The father all but sneered before he smirked instead, stepping aside to allow Nimue space to pass him with a light bow.
In that case, you may as well come down for mass. My rose will be thirsty, and fresh blood is always preferable for such things.
Only once they had left and were out of sight and sound did the guardian release the girl. Irinka swore that she could taste fire and smell flowers where the shadow had touched her, but she didn't linger on the odd sensations as she sprinted for the door. It slammed shut a moment before she was through it, physically pushing her back and onto her bottom. She managed to pull herself up just in time to see the golden key materialize on the inside of the door, turn, hear the lock click shut, and then the key disappeared in a puff of smoke and shadow. She turned on the guardian, cursing at it for its gall and begging for it to let her out because her friend was in danger. The formless thing gestured silently, and the girl's tear-filled gaze was directed back up to the shield pointed out before. She didn't understand, and it took a few moments for her to calm down before the shadow came to her once more. Again, she smelled flowers and smoke. It reached for her, and when Irinka didn't lash out, it caressed her cheek to comfort her. It waited with her until she had tamed her breathing, before it stepped closer to occupy the same space she did. Irinka couldn't bring herself to be truly scared, as it weightlessly carried her up to the shield. The girl reached out, tried to take it off the wall, but it shifted sideways instead, revealing a small crawl space that would take her directly over the chapel. It was a long way down, and she gulped in fear, but the mouse couldn't just do nothing. She took her first step, and the beam creaked softly from age beneath her foot.
Damn it.
She hissed and took her weight back off the rotten beam.
What now?
She whispered, turning back, but the guardian was gone. In its absence, an ostentatious thing, a blade with diamonds studded into the golden hilt, and crystal feathers hanging off it from a silver chain.
Well, that's helpful.
She huffed softly, but picked it up and put it in her belt anyway. Waste not, want not. It might be enough to bribe the body man, if they ever got out of this damn mess long enough to find him. Setting her mind to the task at hand, Irinka figured it might take her about 6 steps to get across the first beam to the structural one ahead of her. It was a long shot, but she could see curtains on the far end of the large room, covering up what she could only guess was a huge window. If this was formerly a temple to the god of light, it would make sense to have a window in the chapel, wouldn't it? There was no telling what state those would be in, but she would have somewhat of a soft landing if they tore at least. Irinka took a deep breath and sent up a prayer for luck. She couldn't remember the name of the deity who watched over fate, but it was better than nothing, and she stepped out.